This is Duke University.
First, thanks for inviting me to speak on these papers. I just have to say that I'm so impressed with the work that is being done at the undergraduate level that it's just really kind of mind-blowing. So I have much more than 5 minutes worth of comments, but I'm just going to kind of concentrate it down and do a couple themes that relate to the theme of this conference and then pose one question or sort of a series of one long question to each of the panelists. So the first thing that came to mind, and this is in reference to Jalene and Gina's papers, is the idea of movement and the mobility of people as both a problem and a solution, depending on the context. I found in Gina's paper this really sort of provocative and interesting way of thinking about mobility in terms of temporality. This idea that the Spanish Jews from these 3 cases were allowed to pass through the country in this transitory moment. And that this passing through, in effect, was an acknowledgement both of their human value as Spaniards, as citizens of Spain, that it was also sort of a temporary acknowledgement of that. It was like, you're good enough and we're going to give you this for the time being to get you out of here, and so we'll latch onto the notion of you as Spanish, not Jewish, to a certain extent, in order to move these people through our country. And so in that way, mobility was seen as a solution, but they had to stay in a mobile state for the solution to work. And I find that really interesting. Likewise, in Jalene's paper, I found it really fascinating, this idea of calling upon the Rwandan refugees to move back to the country as proof that the problem has been solved, right? Asking people to return so that they can serve as evidence that the problems of the past are now solved. And that mobility is a central tenet of being able to prove that the solution exists. Now, in terms of Alicia's paper, what I think is so fascinating is this movement of ideals and the movement of aesthetics across space and time. I really like the way that your research looks at the Chinese diaspora across different nation states. I think that's really important. And what I find particularly interesting is this idea that aesthetics and ideals and aesthetic ideals are linking populations to each other, and they're also linking different communities and populations to global capital flows. So for instance, with your example from the movie Player magazines, my immediate thought was, well, what would be really fascinating as a next project perhaps would be to think about what the local offices for the movie Player, how they produce certain images and how they recognize their sort of market in that sense. And finally, the one thing that sort of links all of these papers together is this idea of the confrontation of narratives. That in each of the research projects, we see that different types of narratives are coming into conflict with each other. In the case of the skin whitening creams and Alicia's research, what I see is that there's a confrontation between ideals of what is a pure natural beauty, which may be in fact a very modern ideal of beauty. I think that's something we're thinking about, that the notion of naturalness as beautiful is not necessarily a universal, nor is it historically universal. But that's then kind of butting up against notions of and efforts to acknowledge that beauty is something that we have to work very hard at, right? And this is not limited to the Chinese context, but in fact that there's quite a lot of work that goes into looking naturally beautiful. And a lot of money, as you point out in your paper, that is required to achieve this status. With Jalene and Gina's papers, what I see here really is a confrontation between notions of fear and notions of safety, right? The fear of human mobility, the fear of people on the move, versus the idea that people are safe when they're still and sedentary, right? That safety comes in being in one place at one time. And by extension, the fear of time itself, right? The fear of temporality, of time being something that is always going to pass, right, on underneath us, and the safety in being timeless, right? The idea that time is home, a home that you can return to, or the idea that once you're still and not moving, everything is going to be safe. So this leads me to my 3 questions. Sorry, I'm rushing a little bit because I just wanted to decide too much to say. So my question for Jillian is, what if we were to approach this moment of impending change, right? The coming of July 2013, not in terms of the return, I'm thinking of it as a return, but in terms of what will come next. What are the competing imaginations of what the future should be, and who is a part of that future? Whether it's in Rwanda, and you talk about this a little in your paper in terms of state narratives of peace, but also for the refugees themselves. Who do they imagine in their future? Can they even imagine that? Is that even a possible thing for them to think about? What are their options? Have some people left the refugee camps? And are there similar cases in other contexts where the cessation clause has been invoked and people have been repatriated? How would that sort of shed light on what's happening right now? Gina, my question is a little bit shorter, and that is what does it mean in the historical context that you're researching to make sort of, I call this half a claim to diaspora and belonging, because they sort of half claimed the Spanish Jews. They said, okay, you're Spanish, but you're Jewish, so you need to pass through here. And what does that mean in terms of sort of only claiming one half of an identity by the state? And Alicia, my challenge to you, and I'll pose this question, is to sort of historicize beauty in a way, and you give mention to this, but to think about how beauty can link populations across distance and time in a symbolic aesthetics of value. How, if we think about beauty in skin whitening, as you suggest, this is not something that is just new, that is new in China. So what is new about what's happening in what you see? Isn't it just, to play the devil's advocate, money in the cosmetics industry? Aren't they just capitalizing on what has already been a beauty, an aesthetic ideal? And what is changing in the discourses that you're examining? So, I'll leave it there. But thank you again for some really rich papers, and I have lots of other questions. So can't wait to talk to you.
I'll ask the students to hold their answers until Leo has a chance as well. Leo Ching is on the clock.
So again, I would also like to thank you for inviting me to the discussion for these very interesting and engaging papers. I think the quality of the papers reflect positively the interdisciplinary approach and the multi-regional focuses of international comparative studies. More importantly, I think they also speak to the tremendous commitment and academic rigor inspired by a handful of faculty who actually runs the program. I'm talking about you, Francis Hassel, Sherry Ross, Robin Kirk, and Lee Kambarama. You all should be very proud. I really enjoyed reading the papers. They're like good mystery stories that present us with puzzles, clues, and tentative answers. Be it the enigma of cultural Chinese skin whitening in cosmetic merchandising, the conundrum of post-genocide reconciliation in Rwanda, or the mystery over Spanish diplomats' assistance to Jewish refugees in World War II. To a large extent, I think all three papers speak to the question of history, or rather, how to historicize. To historicize is to account for the condition of possibility that makes certain event possible in the first place. Be it the development of capitalism under globalization, as Elisa's paper talks about, or state-sanctioned post-genocidal reconciliation, or the convergence of multiple historical memories during World War II. But to historicize is also to point to the underlying and accompanying ideological works that overdetermine a particular event. For Alicia, transculturation denotes the transformation of traditional cultural Chinese definition of color difference to modern Western racialism and standard of beauty. How multinational corporations tap into traditional Chinese myth to promote cosmetic products, for example. For Jillian, the negotiation between home and belonging points to the oppressive mechanism propagated by the Rwanda state with a recommendation by the UNHCR that continues to divide refugees along ethnic lines despite some real progress towards reconciliation. It gives voices to those refugees who continue to live precariously under state authority. Finally, for Jenna, the efforts by the Spanish diplomats are explained from different scales of historical interpretation, from the historical memory of the 1492 expulsion to nation self-refashioning to individual diplomats' social and class affiliations. It paints a complex and interweaving history of trauma, memory, and heroism. I'll leave with three sort of individual questions for each of the presenters. For Jenna, I really appreciate the systematic, rather than a kind of individualized explanation to the saving of the Jewish refugees, because oftentimes individual heroism is valorized out of sort of historical context. But I mean, so this is sort of interesting because obviously, I mean, you sort of mentioned the fascist state, but there's one state you did not mention, which is Japan, right? And in the case of Japan, it's also well known that a Japanese diplomat by the name of Suihara Chilme, who supposedly saved 6,000 Jewish refugees in Lithuania, right? So in that case, I mean, Japan doesn't quite share the kind of history that you laid out about, I mean, you know, the Spanish sort of history with expulsion, Inquisition, and Franco's, you know, authoritarianism, and so on and so forth. So how do we explain this particular incident in which the Japanese diplomat sort of, you know, saved the refugees? So is that the question of contingency, right? I mean, and if that's the case, then how do we negotiate the personal and the historical? Right? And for Jermaine, you know, this wonderful paper, I really like the way that you again sort of in a way refused the kind of you know, standardized narrative about reconciliation and kind of progress and development, right? So my question is, are there other forms of reconciliation that are not state-sanctioned? In other words, are there other practices, whether it's by NGO or other sort of forms of, you know, sort of popular movements that allow us to imagine reconciliation outside of the discourse of the state or economic development? And I say this because, I mean, it just happens that we have Lily Ye, the artist, the barefoot artist here. I think she's here until Saturday. She and some artists actually did this wonderful project called Rwanda Healing Project. I have a DVD if you would like to see it. What they do is they actually go to there's some grave sites, and together with you know, children and adults, they painted the walls and sort of create a kind of space where people can enter the darkness of graveyard, but you know, through the kind of memory and through a kind of you know, sort of using art as a way to heal. So whether there's, I mean, you can imagine other forms of healing that's outside of the state narrative. And Alicia, I mean, this is a really interesting project. I especially, I mean, appreciate the way that you sort of not homogenize race discourse, right? That whiteness, darkness, I mean, you know, are always already a kind of colonial project, right? Because we actually sort of allow us to think about the kind of traditional, quote-unquote, Chinese sort of imaginary of what it means to be, you know, I mean, pale and dark and so on and so forth, which is based more on a kind of social distinction rather than a kind of racialized that, notion that denotes people, difference between people and nation, which of course connotes the difference in progress, development, modernization, and so on and so forth. So I like that very much. However, I'm wondering, I mean, historically, how do we see, I mean, I think maybe Jenny's question also alludes to that, how do we see the encounter in which one discourse, right, overrides the other? In other words, how do we explain, or can we sort of, you know, have some kind of periodization in which the kind of modern Western notion of race or racism, in a way, overrides the traditional notion of color differences based on social distinctions, right? Because, I mean, you know, because one way to think about this is of course, the way Asians also internalize racism, right? I mean, Asians are racist as well, right? I mean, we're not immune from the larger process of racialization. And the other thing is you sort of, I mean, frame the paper in terms of sort of West and cultural China, right? I'm wondering, especially in the case of Taiwan, and you know, Jennifer will know this, you know, the Japanese cosmetic products was already there in the 30s and the 40s, right? And the Japanese themselves have a very sort of ambivalent relationship with Western racism. In turn of the century, for example, the so-called Adam Smith of Japan, Takuji Okiji, actually talked about how the Japanese are not yellow. In fact, that the Japanese are white, right? In fact, that because if you look at the progress in terms of economic and military, that the Japanese cannot be yellow, because yellow meant you're behind, underdeveloped, and savages, uncivilized, and so on and so forth, right? So to what extent do you think maybe the Japanese discourse has infiltrated in different ways into Taiwan, especially given how sort of Japanese products are massively consumed, in Taiwan and sort of China as well. So again, so I'll just end there, and again, thank you so much for a wonderful paper, and look forward to talking to you.